Greetings, programs. Welcome to episode 19. Evidence still does not work like that. So hopefully it's a short one today. So this one follows on from our epistemology episode in episode 12. In this hopefully shorter discussion, we will look at some specific examples of flawed evidence that have come up in online discussion. And I'm hoping I'll be making a short series out of these sorts of things. I also want to say something about YouTube comment sections. If you go into them expecting to change the mind of the person you're dealing with, you will be frustrated and annoyed. Don't expect that. Instead, if you go in making comments to an audience, real or imagined, using the person you are conversing with as the example, then, when you inevitably fail to persuade them, you have not wasted your time and you may have learned something. Because everything that you said is there for posterity, and any viewers that may stumble upon your words at a later date. Also, if you act like a good researcher, a good scientist, and only make claims that you can back with evidence, then it can be a learning experience for you and anybody who happens to read it. I can say for myself that I hate being called out for saying things that turn out to be wrong, so I check with Dr. Google before I say things like, "Sorry, but there is evidence for evolution, and here it is." When looked at through that lens, even arguing with a flat earther is not fruitless. Sure, the earth is round, but do you know how to prove it to someone if asked? One argument with a flurfer and some research later, and not only do you know it, but now you know how to show it to other people. On with the show. So the thing we are dealing with today is sometimes known as the argumentum ad martyrdom, which has two sides to its coin, one obvious and one insidious. The obvious part refers to the evidence of the Bible that clearly Jesus was real and was resurrected because the apostles were all martyred and no one would sacrifice their life for a lie. So obviously it's true. Well, there's a few problems with this. First off, the only record of their martyrdoms are in the Bible, which is the source of the claims. So we don't even know if it's true. But even assuming that it is true that the apostles were all martyred for their belief in Jesus, does that then make it true? No again. People routinely do things for reasons they think are good or even real, but on later evidence turn out to be mistakes, self-deception, or even deliberate fabrications. And any believer already knows this. Take suicide attacks, for example. Hindus, Christians, and Muslims are all on record as making suicide attacks at some point in history. Sure, the Muslims are more recently famous for it, but even the Buddhists have managed it once or twice. And your typical Christian is not going to accept that those people were right in their beliefs. And yet, nonetheless, they all died for their beliefs. At least the suicide attackers did. And this is in something as clear-cut and unarguable as a suicide attack. And they've been martyred in other ways as well, ways that are less obvious. The Buddhist monk, for example, is famous for setting himself on fire in protest all those years ago, and it was caught on tape. Yeah, that was the thing. Heck, a couple of minutes on Google will show you martyrs of every faith. See footnote number 1 for a list of suicide attacks. Now, those people could have died for the truth. But then we have to ask, is there a more probable explanation? After all, we know from epistemology that if the evidence points to another explanation, it cannot be exclusive evidence for the first explanation. If you find evidence that the subject under investigation is red or blue, it's not evidence that it was red. It would, however, be evidence that it's not green. So let's apply this to our subject. We know, and the believers accept, that it's possible to sacrifice your life for reasons other than the truth, as demonstrated by the suicide attackers of various faiths, who the believers will accept are wrong. So we have to ask, are there any other explanations for what we see? Well, it is possible that it never happened and the whole thing is fabrication. And this is an explanation that believers already accept. For faiths other than their own, of course. Or there's a possibility that if they did actually die, if they were martyred, they did so thinking they were right, but the actuality did not match what they thought. They were wrong, in other words. And one last option, assuming that they did in fact die, is that maybe they knew it was not true, and died anyway thinking that what they were building was worth it. Dr. Carrier has a long and detailed post on this topic. See footnote number 2, Did the Apostles Die for a Lie? So there we have a few of the many possible options, and we must ask a simple question. Which is more likely? Is the best explanation for the biscuits going missing and the child being covered in crumbs that the child ate the bickies and is lying? Or did fairies really come flying through the window, eat all the bickies and sprinkle crumbs all over the child? Which is more likely? Well, we have the same issue here. Is it more likely that some never-before-seen event that defies physics and biological science occurred, such as a dead body coming back to life? Or is it more likely that somebody made something up? Or that someone was wrong? Or that someone was willing to sacrifice their life for something they believed was really worth it? When you strip away the believer's assumption that God is real, the level of likelihood in this event becomes obvious. You get the same when you're dealing with evolution deniers. They rarely answer the question when it's put to them. Which is more likely? That millions of evolutionary scientists across the world are all wrong about their own chosen field which they've been researching for decades, or that some uneducated creationists misunderstood something about a complex field. Now, the second part of the argumentum ad martyrdom is the insidious part. This is the part that gives the believer the sense that any perceived attack against them is justifying their position. This is a version of the Galileo Gambit. See footnote number 3 for details on that. The simple version is described by the thought process thusly. Galileo was right, and they laughed at him. They are laughing at me, so I must be right too. No, this is faulty thinking. Galileo was not right because he was laughed at. He was right because his evidence was good when examined. Also, in a separate event, he was laughed at. To assume that he was right because he was laughed at is the same non-logic as assuming that people with mustaches are evil because several famous people with mustaches are widely regarded as evil. See Hitler, Stalin, etc. There is no logical link between scorn and actually being right. Galileo was eventually able to prove that he was right, which is the key part that often gets overlooked. And here is a quote. It is important to point out here that people with out-of-mainstream ideas who compare themselves to Edison and Galileo are never actually right. I can guarantee you Einstein did not go around telling people, look, I know this theory of general relativity sounds wacky, but that's what they said about Galileo. Quote from Jordan Ellenberg. The main reason that this side of the coin is something I call insidious is that it blends nicely with the persecution and martyrdom complex that a lot of the severely religious have about being attacked by the world. They are primed by their holy books to expect it, and then when it arrives in response to some truly wacky comment, like the shape of the earth or God poofing everybody into existence, they feel vindicated. Add this to the relatively well-known backfire effect, and the more conclusively you show your interlocutor to be wrong, the deeper they will dig in. See footnote number 4 for the backfire effect. So much so that you can show a religious person to be wrong in detail, over and over, with incontrovertible evidence that they are wrong, from multiple sources, and they will leave the encounter believing even more strongly, and worse, because of the religious aspect, they will feel vindicated by your attack against them. On some level, some of them want it. They want something to push against. And so if you go into a comment thread hoping to convince that person, you will be frustrated. Instead, take as a victory, as successful, truthful refutation of their points for the benefit of somebody who may stumble upon your words later. Remember, it is possible that these words will outlast our species as it is now. You are on show, potentially for eternity. So try to show the better side of the human race as it is now. Now, if you want to persuade a specific person, you might need to try something different, because no amount of evidence short of God himself showing up in person and telling them they are wrong is going to convince them. And in some cases, not even that. Now, I will point out that Saitan Bruggencate is on record as saying that if God himself shows up and tells Sai that Sai is wrong about the Bible, Sai is going to ignore God and stick with the Bible. He said this more than once. Matt Dillahunty and Aaron Ra have both mentioned this in passing, so if you're a fan of their channels, you will have heard this more than once. So even the actual presence of God might not be enough for some folks. So if you must convince that person, I recommend the Columbo technique. See footnote number 5 for a link to the Columbo technique. In short, act dumb. and they will let stuff slip by showing off how smart they are. Ask questions as if you genuinely don't know, and they will explain it to you. And then ask questions in an open format about the flaws that they have just revealed. But you must start off this way. Columbo himself, the character, even dressed Scruffy to make himself seem more humble and low, and thus likely to be underestimated. You cannot smash your interlocutor with facts and solid evidence, and then switch to the Columbo technique later. It just doesn't work that way. Also, check out Anthony Magnabosco's Street Epistemology for a related but different way of asking questions so as to sow doubt. See footnote number 6, Street Epistemology. So that's it for another much shorter epistemology episode. Tune in next week for another, or possibly for round 3 of Dispatches from the Abortion Debate. Bye for now.